It is a real privilege. I wanted to share a little bit about my background. I'm originally from Canada, Western Canada, like Ukraine. We're the breadbasket of Canada in Saskatchewan, where my brothers actually farm wheat. So they grow a lot of wheat and other crops. And I always thought I came from a fairly monocultural or homogenous background, but upon further reflection, I realized that I came from a multicultural background. My parents' first language was French. They're French Canadians, and there's a fairly large number of French Canadians living in the West. Although the further west you go in Canada, closer to Vancouver, the least number of French speakers you might encounter. And my wife actually has Ukrainian ancestry. Her grandfather, I'm going to show a picture of him here, Petro from Lviv, came to Canada, I think around in the early 1920s. And after getting off the ship, he decided to take a train across our country to Vancouver. After a few days, they were in Winnipeg. The conductor said where they were. He said, "Where's Winnipeg?" And they said, "It's about halfway across the country." And he had had enough traveling in the train. So he got off in Winnipeg and began his life as a carpenter in Canada. So if it wasn't for him coming as an immigrant, I would have never met my wife, Vicky. So I'm obligated to our Ukrainian ancestry. Then my niece is a registered nurse in Edmonton, which also has a very vibrant Ukrainian community. And her daughter, I found these pictures. Well, I saw them on her social media. This is her daughter, my great niece, who actually wants to be a Ukrainian. She has been a part of Ukrainian folkloric dance for many years. So she is a great joy to our family, and I think if she gets a chance to visit your country, she'll definitely take it. Well, I wanted to just talk a little bit about this concept of becoming transculturally effective. This slide here, I've just designed as a Canadian who's now spent almost half my adult life in the United States. And this is really an outdated model of how we relate to other cultures. This is more of a bicultural model where a person from one culture lives or interacts with people of a second culture. And it's fairly straightforward. It's this binary model where we simply have to learn about the host culture, perhaps learn the language, learn more about their values and worldview. And it's fairly clear cut in terms of our understanding. But the problem is, as I mentioned before, it's quite outdated. Interestingly, this person, the foreigner, has been used in derogatory terms for millennia as a squarehead or other disparaging terms. In fact, the French would use this term about the English. And even in Quebec, the French-speaking part of Canada today, they refer to Anglophones as squareheads. And so it's this idea that you are different than me and you are the other and you're unlike us. And so the pressure is on the person with the square head symbolically to adjust to everyone else. But really, it's more like this, even though I've been in the US for about 27 years, I think now. I have to move something on my screen to be able to see what's going on. So in the city I live in, north of Los Angeles, we have about 40 to 45% Latino. And currently in our city of about 400,000, the third most spoken language behind Spanish and English is Punjabi. That's reflected in the orange flag here. And I think most people several years ago would never have dreamed that our third most spoken language would be Punjabi. But this is just a reality of the multicultural context in which most of us live. And of course, for you in Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, that's also a reality. I want you to pay attention to this top row here, notice the person who is quite foreign in their outward expression slowly becomes assimilated in this new culture. And you could actually put yourself into this diagram, but it's a painful process. And it's sort of like getting the corners of your head knocked off, because the person who's now a minority in a new culture, or it could even be working in your own national boundaries, but with people from another background, you have to relinquish some negotiable values. I'll give you just a quick example of what that was like for us coming to the United States. In Canada, at least when we lived there, children from kindergarten through sixth grade typically do not bring homework to do at home. They finish their work at school, they come home, they play sports, maybe hockey or baseball. They might be a part of a club, swim lessons, whatever different activities they might be involved in between the end of school until bedtime. When we came to the United States, our oldest child was only 1 year old, and we had two other children. And my wife and I quickly noticed when they were in grade school that they were getting quite a bit of homework. And my wife in particularly bristled against this idea that we should be bringing homework home with our children at the end of the school day. And one of our American neighbors just said, look, there's nothing you can do about it. That's the way it's done here. And so we recognized we had to relinquish this value we had of having this free time after our children came home from school. And of course, that's just one of many examples that we could think of. This next diagram, I have to click the screen again here. You can put yourself in there. And I know that some of you are not from Ukraine. And Olga, do you know offhand the other nationalities or cultural backgrounds that make up this class? Like, is it 3 or 4 other nationalities or a lot more than that? Do you know?
Alina, do you know through your students there are another nationality?
Or if the students would like, I could check later, they could just type, if they're born or raised in another culture or another language, they could just type that in the chat window.
In general, concerning our university, we have many international students. I need to check the list who is present today, but just now I couldn't just confirm and tell you. But
Sure.
usually, yes, from more than 46 countries, they are representative at our university.
Okay, that is great. So you should be able to track with what
Not only Ukrainian.
Actually, I'm from Azerbaijan and born in Iran.
Okay,
Persian.
wonderful. Yes.
Thank you for answering.
Yes. So you're already studying in a fairly cosmopolitan and diverse context. Now I'm going to show this little television commercial. I think it's like less than 1 minute long. Hopefully the volume will be loud enough for you to hear. And I share this because this television commercial, I think it's for American Express, the credit card, is over 20 years old. And it's just reflective of this idea that we are becoming increasingly diverse, and even homogenous cultures like Japan or Korea are slowly becoming more welcoming to people from other cultures. And, there's still these very strong norms to maintain what they feel should be Japanese or Korean, or certainly in Canada, every culture has their expectations of what that might look like. But I'll just show this commercial and you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about here.
Guys, come on, Tariq, you do up block. Entre le bloc, Zahra, Hemmerwegs, nein, Nowitzki, nein, Valentin an die Ball. Ich dachte, es soll schießen. Schießen. Jeez. Hey, Nashy, how about hustling up a bit, eh? You hoser?
Now, if I were to show this commercial to Canadians, they would laugh because the term hoser is sort of teasing someone from where I come from in Canada. And Steve Nash, who was the MVP one year, many years ago in the NBA, is from Canada. He's from Vancouver, or Victoria. So this idea that I think 5 different languages were spoken on this basketball team in the United States, and people are increasingly comfortable with the idea that we will be multilingual and multicultural. And these are just, 4 groups of friends of mine from my local university, from Japan, from China, from Saudi Arabia, from Peru. And when we have people around us as students or fellow employees, the onus is upon us to be able to become more effective in these transcultural contexts. So instead of going from culture A to B, we might have 5, 6, 10, or in your case, 46 cultures making up one community. And so you have to be much more flexible and nimble in order to be effective in understanding, communicating, working with this diverse group of people. So several years ago, we had an opportunity to work in Hungary for the summer, and we were doing a cross-cultural training for probably 30 Europeans who are going to live in other cultures. And one of the first international students that lived with us here in California was from Denmark. And so we decided to go to Denmark and visit him. He took us to Sweden, which is just a very short trip. And we toured this traditional 18th century Swedish home. And it was a fascinating tour because as we got into the entryway, then the tour guide told us that this was called the welcome beam, this big wooden beam across the ceiling of this house. And she told us that if you were a guest in a Swedish home in the 18th century, it was taboo to walk past this beam because you were the guest and you needed to stay in the entryway of this home until you were invited. And that's very emblematic of what we should be doing culturally as well. We should be waiting to be invited into these different cultural spaces so as not to offend or not to misunderstand the group of people we're working with. And so for the rest of our time, we just want to explore this idea of what are the welcome beams in our communities, what are the cultural cues that we need to pay attention to, and then how can we proceed past these beams in order to be ourselves and be contributors to these societies and groups that we work and live in. So we can start with something as simple as a greeting. One of the subjects of my doctoral dissertation lives in New York City. And this is one thing that I quoted him as saying in the dissertation. He said, just as Michael relates the story of offering what we call in North America a side hug. So let's say I'm going up to a girl and I don't really know her. Some people might shake their hand, or you might just sort of give them a hug from the side to say farewell to this female Korean student, not realizing that while it might be acceptable with a Chinese or a Japanese woman, it was not with Koreans. It was culturally inappropriate for him to even touch her. So he could tell from her response that it was awkward and immediately learned that this behavior was unacceptable and apologized. Even today, my wife and I have an Argentine guest in our home, and we lived in South America for 1 year, and we became very familiar with the South American beso, the kiss on the cheek. You don't actually have to even kiss them on the cheek, but there's a sound that is made and you are fairly close to them. I think in your part of the world, that may be a greeting as well. Well, I went to shake her hand and she looked at me very confused because she knew I lived in South America and thought that I should be utilizing the South American greeting of the beso. So I did a narrative study interviewing the most effective workers in this nonprofit group that welcomed the 1.3 million international students to the United States. And I was interviewing people that were part of the largest group in this nonprofit realm. And the leaders of that group told me who the most effective workers were. And so I did this narrative doctoral dissertation, and I just wanted to share the findings with you. So this diagram expresses it. I have to move the box again so I can see what I'm doing. So we have 3 attitudes that were surfaced. These were common attributes, common traits that these most effective transcultural workers shared. So they had 3 attitudes, 9 behaviors, and 3 experiences. And then I'll talk a little bit more about this heterotopic space later. So we'll start with the 3 attitudes: learning, postponing judgment, and this idea called inquisitiveness. So some of these 15 traits or attributes are more commonly known than others, but the learning attribute, the first one here, just refers to an ongoing, lifelong learning. One of my interviewees was a girl from Seattle, Washington, and she works at the University of Washington with international students. And she told me that as a young girl, 7, 8, 9 years old, when they went to the library as a family, she would go into the linguistics section and she would take up books in the Cyrillic alphabet. She had this fascination with the Cyrillic alphabet. Well, that is very unusual for Americans, but that would be someone who has this desire to learn. The second one is this idea of postponing judgment. This
E oculare взять?
is the idea.
Yeah, we are sorry, everything is fine, yeah.
Are we good? The second one, postponing judgment or suspending judgment, resisting the temptation to criticize other cultures. So living in the US, especially during the Olympics, when Americans get excited about their Olympic team, they chant USA, USA. And that chant would drive me crazy as a Canadian, and I would sort of get angry at this. It felt like superiority among the Americans. And of course, they're just cheering for their own country. There's nothing wrong with that. But from someone from a country that didn't do as well in the Summer Olympics, we did okay in the Winter Olympics, it kind of bothered me, and I had to intentionally postpone judgment and just try to accept their cheering from their point of view. The third one is inquisitiveness, which is closely related to the first one, learning, but with a specific focus on the details, the nuances of the particularities of language, of culture, of a person's worldview, the glasses that they wear to understand the world, or just the details of how they approach life as an individual. Then the next 3, are the behaviors. Sorry, the next 9 are the behaviors. Adapting, again, is fairly straightforward. A friend of mine lived in Kyrgyzstan, and he had this meeting in his apartment with Kyrgyz students. And he noticed around, I think it was 10 or 11 at night, the students would excuse themselves and leave the meeting. They might have some food or some tea, but they would quite abruptly get up to leave. And he was puzzled by why they did this, until he found out that they were trying to catch the last bus back to the place where they lived as students. And he learned that if they had to take a taxi, they might use 1 month of their money on a taxi ride in one night. And so he quickly realized, oh, if you need to leave early to be able to take the much more affordable bus, please do that. So he began to adapt his lifestyle in accordance with the way the Kyrgyz students lived, because he realized that as a Westerner, he might have tried to live out his values as though he was living at home, and this could be very culturally inappropriate in his host culture. This next one, welcoming, this simple idea of being hospitable, which is quite important in most cultures, and in some cultures, it's absolutely incredible how hospitable people will be. The third one, which is not, where did it go here? There we go, loving. This idea of loving people is sort of an unusual term in academic writing. The academic literature, though, is increasingly publishing papers regarding this concept, this idea of treating people as you would want them to treat you. And so that's important. It goes a long way. How we express concern, kindness, care for the outsider. The fourth one, this idea of advocating. Advocating is this idea that you can do for others what they might not be able to do for themselves. And this picture here is of a Korean student named Dae Young. When I first met him, he joined this soccer game that I hosted for 10 years at our local university. And every Friday afternoon, students from 10 or more countries would come to play soccer. And as we became friends, he asked if I would come to him to the Cal State University housing department because he was having significant trouble getting along with his American roommate. And so we had to visit, I think, twice to the director of housing. Finally, he was released from his obligation for the lease to rent his apartment. So as we're walking out of the university, I said to him, well, Dae Young, what are we going to do now? What are you going to do now? You don't have a place to live. And he sort of sheepishly said to me, well, could I live with you? And I said, well, let me send a text to my wife. I think it'll be fine. So she said, of course, he can move in today. And he actually lived in the room I'm sitting in today. And we became very good friends. So this idea of advocating for him, just that he couldn't necessarily articulate what he needed to articulate in the United States because English was not his first language, it was his second language. And I could simply step in and serve him in a way that was practical. This next one is, whoops, I got ahead of myself, eating, number 5. And some of us are pretty good at eating the foods of our host cultures, and some of us might struggle with that a little bit. When Dae Young went home, he sent me a video and he said, Dennis, guess what food I asked my parents to provide for me when I arrived at the airport. They took me straight to this restaurant. And I had no idea what this video was going to be about. So this might make you a little bit uncomfortable, but this was the video he sent me. So I don't know if any of you have eaten raw squid before, but this is raw squid. Now, before you think I'm picking on the Koreans, when we lived in Uruguay, South America, they did not have peanut butter. So I don't know if in your part of the world you eat peanut butter or not, but in Canada, we love our peanut butter. So my wife made peanut butter. We would buy peanuts at the market and she would grind them up and try to make sort of some peanut butter. It wasn't the greatest, but we were happy to find it. When some of our Uruguayan friends asked what this was and we opened the lid, they smelt it and they thought it was absolutely disgusting. And so the food that we think is just perfectly ordinary, most Canadians will eat it. Not every culture, finds consensus on what foods are desirable or not. I don't know if you have any Slovak students here, but this summer we'll be returning to Europe and we're staying with friends in Bratislava. And one of my Slovak friends told me that Americans, while we eat pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving, most American homes will serve pumpkin pie. And when she was invited into an American home as an international student, she thought having pumpkin pie was disgusting because in Slovakia, they feed pumpkins to their pigs. And so that's just another example of these cultural differences. Okay, listening. I often am trying to think of what to say next when another person is talking, instead of just listening attentively to them. And that's a very important one of these 15 skills, to be able to listen well. Then number 7, sharing. This could be sharing your life, sharing your space, sharing your possessions, or maybe your time. Some cultures are very generous with all of these things, and some maybe will guard their time. Americans tend to guard their time a little bit more than some other cultures. Some other places you will visit them and they drop everything that they're doing and become your host and want to do so much for you. There's just these differences. It's not necessarily right or wrong. Number 8, playing. And this is referring to playing the games of the people that we're living with. Here in the United States, when we have Koreans into our home, we will play this game. It's called Ute Nori or Ute, and they throw these sticks on the ground. It's kind of like the game Yahtzee that Americans play. It's different scoring, and the idea there is, instead of always having them to play my games, why don't we offer to play the games that they like to play, and maybe they can teach us those games, and it gives them a greater sense of belonging in this new culture. And then the last of the 9 behaviors is simply practicing, and that just, if it comes to language, maybe it's learning a few words in that other language of your fellow student or coworker, or the person that lives in your dorm. It could be practicing all kinds of things. When we lived in Uruguay, I did not know how to ride the bus, because in Canada, when you are on a bus, there's a nylon cord or a button, and you press the button and it indicates to the driver to stop at the next bus stop. Well, in Uruguay, I did not know what was going on, and all of a sudden I heard this sound through their teeth that they would make. Well, I was one of probably maybe 100 people on a bus. And I thought to myself, I have already missed my stop at the university, and now I have to make this noise that I've never made before. I was very self-conscious, but I thought, I don't want to walk a mile or a kilometer, 2 kilometers back to the university, so I'll just do it. I made this sound. And thankfully, the bus driver stopped at the next stop, and I thought, okay, I've got a very small victory by practicing a cultural cue that I have never done before, but it's required of me in this new culture. Okay, moving to the last section here. I think we're doing okay for time. That's the experiences, 3 experiences, which are developing cross-cultural friendships, this idea of discovering, and then knowing. Developing cross-cultural friendships can be very challenging. I was in Manila, Philippines, working for 6 weeks, and I became friends with this Filipino man. And as we were walking down the street one day, he reached out and held my hand. Well, in Canada, we're a northern people. Our weather is quite cold. We're very comfortable with lots of distance. It's called social proximity. If I'm talking to you, I'm fine if you're a meter or even farther away from me. But in the Philippines, they are very socially proximity close. And in fact, when I was there, Manila was the most densely populated city in the world. So they were very comfortable being very close to one another. And when he held my hand, I felt incredibly uncomfortable. And I had to resist this temptation. It was also an opportunity to postpone judgment. It had nothing to do with homosexuality or anything like that. It was just, in his culture, holding even another man's hand was just a sign of friendship. And so to develop a cross-cultural friendship sometimes can really push us out of our comfort zone. if we're going to be effective in this new realm of friendship. Another example would be in Uruguay, they drink mate. They have a gourd and a metal straw, and they have their yerba mate tea, which is very strong. This drink does not exist in Canada unless you're a Canadian from Argentine, Brazilian, or Uruguayan ancestry. And before COVID, they would even share the straw. So they would just pass this around. And for one, we don't really share out of the same straw in Canada, and we don't drink this really strong tea. We might have coffee or more of the British or Indian tea, but not mate. And so it was another opportunity to grow in these areas of cross-cultural friendship. Then second last, discovering, which is similar to learning and inquisitiveness, but I liken it to the qualities of an astronaut. An astronaut has this fearless quest to learn new worlds. You know, Elon Musk, he launches rockets about 1 hour from where I live. And sometimes at night, you can see it, the light of the rocket going into outer space. My son, who's a mechanical engineer, has said to me, "Oh, Dad, if I had the opportunity to go into space, I would do that." This is the attitude of someone who has this attribute to discover. They're like an astronaut willing to learn new worlds, even if it's very different from our own paradigm, our own background. And then lastly, of the 15 is this idea of knowing. Knowledge wielded humbly and demonstrated selectively can be very powerful in terms of being effective among other cultures, being willing to study a little bit about their culture, being able to learn in an ongoing way about them, their families, their traditions, their language, their religion, their economy, their politics, all of these different things. And then there was one thing that really surprised me in my dissertation when I was writing the findings, and it was this idea of heterotopic space. And this is the idea of worlds within worlds. And I'll give another diagram here. We have the Ukrainian flag. I think this is the Polish and Romanian flags. So let's say this was someone from a Ukrainian ethnicity working in Kiev, but maybe you have a Polish co-worker or fellow student, maybe someone from Romania, Slovakia, Czech Republic, one of your neighboring countries, Iran, Kazakhstan, whichever country you're from. Instead of expecting the space to be only inclusive of Ukrainian thoughts, foods, values, ideas, language, it might be opening it up so that someone from another background can also feel at home. That does not mean you have to relinquish your convictions or your ideals as a Ukrainian or living here in the United States. I do not jettison or throw overboard my Canadian values, but maybe there are ways that I can curtail those values so that a Filipino, a Punjabi, a Mexican, a Guatemalan, a Nicaraguan, a Brazilian, someone from Europe could feel at home in my space as well. So it's creating this space that's different from the American concept of a safe space. I don't know if you've heard of this idea. On American colleges and universities, there's this big emphasis on safe space. I'm totally fine with safe spaces, but I'm not talking about safe spaces here, because to have a safe space means you have to leave at the door your personal convictions. And I don't think anybody should have to do that. I think you should be able to hold on to those things that you value at all times. You do not have to give them up, but it means that you're also not going to push the ideas of someone else who's a guest in your space out the door. For example, this Argentine lady who's spending a couple nights with us, we're trying to think of ways, what would she like to do while she's here? Maybe she has some ideas of what she would like to see that me as a dual Canadian-American citizen might assume she is not interested in doing. And so it's creating space for the other person's ideas without relinquishing your own ideas. Yeah, so a couple other thoughts on this concept. A Yale University professor, Walter Mead, says this about this idea. Utopia is a place where everything is good. Dystopia, if you read like a dystopian novel like 1984, or just when things do not work out the way you want, that's dystopic. But heterotopia is where things are simply different. It's a collection whose members have few or no intelligible connections with one another, but this space allows you to make those connections. And I assume some of those 46 cultural representatives in Ukraine feel some of that they can enjoy Ukrainian culture, but also still be themselves. I'll skip these next two for the sake of time. But one other term, just to come to almost a close here, is called cosmopolitan localism. And this was coined by Gideon Kossoff of the Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in his article, Cosmopolitan Localism, the Planetary Networking of Everyday Life in Place. And it's this idea that even in a local area, you can have a cosmopolitan feel to it. And I think your capital city would have that, just like Paris would have that, or Rome or London. But you can even have that in small spaces. You can even have that in my Canadian village of 400 people, because not everyone is the same. We have some indigenous people. We have people actually from Ukrainian ancestry that live in my hometown. We have French, we have English, we have Dutch. And so what does it look like to have this welcoming cosmopolitan localism? I'll skip this one too for the sake of time, but this is just an example. You can look at it later of something they did in New York City to make people feel included. And then I have to end with a picture of my soccer team. I think at this game we had 10 different nationalities. I think I have 8 flags up there. But I made a rule that only one American could come to my soccer game. And because in the past, several American students saw what we were doing and said, oh, I want to play football, I want to play soccer. So they came, but my international student friends did not feel ownership of that game because the Americans kind of took over the soccer game because it was at their university and they were born there. So after we had this experience, I said to the Americans, hey guys, you are more than welcome to start a new game on the next field, because we need to have a game for international students so that they can feel like they can be themselves with no one majority culture assuming all this space. And they would come up to me after and thank me and said, thank you for making that rule, because we really enjoy it when there's all these different nationalities here and we can just play as equals here at this university. Okay, so I have a couple questions for you. The first one is, of the 15 attributes that are listed here on this screen on the left, which one or ones do you think you need to develop? If you look at that list, probably 1 or 2 stand out as qualities or competencies or traits that maybe are not strong for you. Like for me, under the behavior number 5, eating, if someone were to put some unusual food before me, I will try to eat it and be polite, but my wife will eat anything. She would eat the raw squid in front of her. I think I might try a raw squid too, but I've also been offered some food that is very exotic to my palate, and so I'm reluctant to try it. But some people are very good at that. I'm also not very good at the number 2 attitude, postponing judgment. I can tend to be quite judgmental of other cultures. thinking in my own ethnocentricity that my culture is superior. Well, that's probably not the healthiest way to live in community with multiple cultures. And so you might identify one or more area that you could work on or develop. And then the second one would be related to this space that we can create. What must you change in order to create this new space? So here in my home, when international students come, I don't want them to feel like they're coming to America. I want them to feel like they're coming to a space. Yes, we live here as dual citizens, Canadian, American. Both my grandfathers were American citizens. My wife's grandmother was American. Of course, her grandfather was Ukrainian. But when they come to our home, we don't want them to feel like they have to become part American or Canadian. We want them to be themselves and that they can just live out of who they are. And of course, they're going to try to adapt to life in America because they live here now. They're a guest in this culture. But maybe there's some things that I can do, like maybe in the background, instead of playing American music, maybe I could play Ukrainian music or Indian music, depending on who's visiting our home. So that would be an example of a couple questions to think about as we close. And it's something that everyone can develop. I made this little list that you could print off later. I think Olga might provide this for you, but I filled it out for myself. I don't think I'm really poor in any area because I've been working with international students for 30 years, but I'm not great either. I left this blank because I feel like I have a lot to learn. So I'm lacking in some of these attributes. I'm average in some, and I'm good at some of them because I've been practicing and honing these qualities for some time. So because of the admixture of your specific qualities and character traits, you're actually able to create or co-create these heterotopic spaces that allow others to be themselves and engage in meaningful reciprocal relationships. This idea that the relationship is not unidirectional, it's reciprocal, it's bidirectional, it's an exchange. I give, but I also receive. And there's equality that is a value in those relationships. Okay, I gotta end with a funny commercial too. You'll understand what this commercial is about. It's Roberto Carlos, who is a soccer star for Brazil, and he's visiting Japan. And it's just a little fun on a cultural cue.